The US only has around 5% of the world's population, but we have about 25% of the world's prison population. So, why is this, and how did it come to be that we lock up more of our people than any other country in the world? Well, tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about mass incarceration in the United States. Now, first, I'm going to tell you about some of the factors that are driving mass incarceration. Then, I'm going to tell you about some of the effects mass incarceration has on Americans. And finally, I'm going to tell you about some alternatives to mass incarceration that are being looked at in different parts of the world. So, let me explain what I mean. Now, there's three main factors that are driving mass incarceration in the U.S. the war on drugs, harsh sentencing laws, and prison privatization. In 1971, President Nixon declared the war on drugs. And according to civil rights lawyer Michelle Alexander, this was really about rolling back the gains of the civil rights movement. So Alexander says that after the civil rights movement, black people were allowed to vote in more places and allowed to move more freely in different neighborhoods. But what happened was that with the onset of the war on drugs, all of a sudden you could be arrested, stripped of your voting rights as a felon, and you could be stopped in a neighborhood at any time and detained and searched. And so because these laws were always applied selectively, Alexander says that they're really about controlling people's civil rights. What you also had in the 1980s was some pretty harsh sentencing laws being passed by the government. For example, the federal government passed a law saying that anyone caught with 5 grams of crack would have to be given a mandatory minimum 5-year sentence, even first-time offenders. Also, a lot of states followed suit with similar laws, and California passed a 3 strikes law. In 1995, a man was convicted of stealing a piece of pizza, and because it happened to be his third offense, he was given a life sentence. So you can see how these laws have really added towards our skyrocketing prison population. And finally, prison privatization. During the 1990s, President Clinton unrolled a plan to slash the federal workforce by farming out a lot of the prison maintenance, prison construction to private corporations. And so now we've come to a situation we have today where the private prison industry is one of the fastest growing industries in the US. It has its own trade groups, lobbyists, magazines, and according to an article in Truth Out magazine, it's also lobbied a lot of state legislators to pass laws that will benefit it. For example, Arizona a few years back passed a law called SB 1070, which mandates that all police officers, if they suspect someone is undocumented, has to ask for their citizenship papers. And so what's happened is that Corrections Corporation of America lobbied very heavily to pass this, and they also happen to own a lot of detention centers which detain immigrants. So you can see their obvious financial interest in this. Now that I've explained to you some of the factors that are pushing mass incarceration in the US, let me tell you about some of the effects it's having. And a lot of these are obvious, the splitting up of families, taking children away from their parents. But let's also look at some of the financial costs. According to a nonprofit called the Vera Institute of Justice, the average state spends between $30,000 and $60,000 every year incarcerating someone, while they spend about $11,000 for each public school student. So you can see states are spending about 2 or 3 times as much to incarcerate someone every year as they are to educate someone. Also, if you want to look at the effects it's having on civil rights, under the Sixth Amendment, all Americans are guaranteed the right to a jury trial. But what's happened over the last few decades is because prison sentences have been getting so harsh, a lot of defendants are intimidated into taking a plea bargain rather than ever going to trial. And so, according to a report that just came out last year by Human Rights Watch, 97% of federal defendants will take a plea deal and never actually get to court. So you can see how this is really having an effect on someone's right to a jury trial. And now that I've explained some of the effects of mass incarceration, let me tell you a little bit about some alternatives to mass incarceration that are being looked at in different parts of the world. In the country of Portugal, legalized every drug, not just marijuana, decriminalized every drug, and it's put a lot of that money that went towards prohibition into treatment. And a lot of people at the time, this was in 2001, said, it's going to create drug addicts. But what happened was today, a lot of articles have been written about Portugal because it happens to have one of the lowest rates of drug abuse in the European Union. And rather than spending all this money in incarceration, it's now able to take a fraction of that and put it into treatment. And so a lot of states in the U.S. are now looking at the success it's had and slowly putting into place similar options, such as in Washington or in Oregon, where they've just begun to legalize marijuana. Also, another alternative to mass incarceration that's been looked at is called restorative justice. And this is the idea that someone who's committed an offense will be taken in front of peers from the community, people that have been affected, and they'll have to sit and share stories with one another and hear personally how this has affected them, and work together to find a solution that will benefit the community rather than taking them away from the community. So this is done outside the legal system. It's the courts allow this to happen in order to free up space to prosecute more dangerous offenders. And a lot of studies have been done on restorative justice. One of them was just done a few years ago at the University of Wisconsin, and it found that there was less recidivism in people when they went through these restorative justice programs. So that's another alternative that's being looked at now in various states. So tonight I've told you about mass incarceration in the U.S., and I hope next time when you have a debate with someone, rather than just acting emotionally or maybe reciting something you heard from the news, you can really sit down and look at the costs and benefits of mass incarceration and see what makes sense to you and how you feel about the situation.